You're watching California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the Cannon House office building in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Adam Schiff. He's a member of the United States Congress. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
We appreciate it. I want to speak with you about guns and gun violence. As you know, in the United States Senate recently, it appeared there'd be some movement on the question of background checks, but that body, which has a 60-vote threshold for moving legislation forward, was not able to reach those 60 votes. What's your sense on the future of gun control in the wake of the violence at Sandy Hook Elementary?
Well, I think that measure will be back, and it was a grave disappointment for all of us that support common sense gun safety measures. We have a partial background check system right now, which is kind of crazy. I think most Americans don't fully understand how it works. And essentially, if you go to a licensed gun dealer, they will do a background check to make sure you're not a criminal or aren't so mentally ill as to be a danger. But if you get turned down, you can go out in the parking lot of that same store and buy that gun from somebody off the back of their truck, and they don't have to do a background check. That's crazy.
What's also interesting is there's a concept, for those that don't live or work in the gun industry, of the gun show loophole. You can go to a gun show, and the gun show proprietor is not required to do a background check. Is that right, sir?
That's exactly right. And I think because that term is so common, people think the loophole only applies to gun shows. It actually applies to everyone but the licensed dealers. So whether you buy it off a truck, or you buy it at a gun show, or you buy it in someone's backyard, there's no requirement of background check. It's only when you go to the dealer. In fact, you can go online and you can buy a weapon from a licensed dealer and have the background check, or you can go to another web page and buy the exact same gun, no background check. That makes no sense whatsoever. The Toomey Manchin bill was a partial solution to that. It would have gotten rid of the gun show loophole, so it would apply background checks in gun shows. It would have applied to most online transactions where there's advertising involved, but it still would have exempted private-to-private sales, most private-to-private sales. So even that partial measure couldn't get through the Senate. It just incomprehensible. But Brad, I think it's going to be back.
You do?
I do. The Senate president, and this is a tough issue in Nevada where he comes from, is nonetheless a tenacious man.
Harry Reid.
I cannot believe that Harry Reid is going to let this go. So this issue is going to be back, and tragically, it comes back every month or 2 months or 3 with a tragedy.
I have to ask you, we think about what happened in Boston recently. The weapons of mass destruction in that case were bombs, manufactured bombs. If the weapons had been assault rifles or another type of gun, do you think that would have changed the debate?
It would have been a different debate, but it's hard for me to imagine something that was more moving, more grievous than what took place at Sandy Hook. I mean, to see those young lives taken that way, if that doesn't motivate us, I mean, I don't know what would.
So, but that's the question. Sandy Hook didn't change the laws. Virginia Tech did not. The Milwaukee Sikh incident did not. Aurora, Colorado did not. Gabrielle Giffords, a member of your caucus.
She's Columbine, Stockton, Granada Hills, I mean, the list goes on and on.
So why? Why don't we see bona fide change?
Well, I think we're going to, because I really think we've reached a tipping point on this issue. And yes, we had a serious setback in the Senate, but there are now forces coming together, Mayor Bloomberg, one of the more effective ones, who are now starting to fund the opposition. We've always been out-financed by the NRA, out-organized by the NRA, but now those in support of common sense measures are getting organized for the first time, and I think it's going to make a difference.
I want to continue this conversation when we come back. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back on California Edition. Sir, you mentioned Michael Bloomberg, and he is the mayor of New York. He supports an organization called Mayors Against Gun Violence. Recently, there was a convention held by the National Rifle Association, and you may have seen that Glenn Beck was there, a well-known conservative commentator, and he showed a picture of Mr. Bloomberg giving us the Nazi salute. And it's clear where the NRA is going with this. I mean, they really see the question of gun violence and gun control as an impingement on their freedoms, on their Second Amendment rights. And so, given that divide, how does the Congress come together?
Well, the NRA leadership may view it that way, and some of the right-wing commentators do, but the American people don't. And even a majority of gun owners don't view it that way. The Toomey Manchin bill, in fact, something broader than that, a truly universal background check bill, has the support of 90% of the American people, has the support of an overwhelming majority of gun owners. So here, the leadership of the gun lobby is out of step with its own members. The Congress is way out of step with the American people. And that can only happen for so long. So I'm optimistic, even though there's a lot to be dispirited about in what we saw in the Senate recently. This issue is not going away, and those of us that are determined to pass gun safety measures aren't going anywhere either.
I've seen those polls, and they are persuasive, but the Senate was only able to muster 55 votes, still a majority. In the House, that body is dominated by Republicans. And you saw the recent NRA convention, and it was really a salute to Republican support. So what motivation do Republican members have to move?
Yeah, the only motivation they have is their constituents calling on them to do it, to do the right thing. And I think that the senators who voted against these common sense measures are already facing repercussions out in their states. And that's not something they've had to deal with in the past. In the past, the only repercussion was if they didn't have a perfect score with the NRA, they had to worry about their right flank. Now they've got to worry about their middle, that the people in their state, in their districts, want something common sense. And now there's a new calculus.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that. You probably saw similar news reports with, for example, Senator Kelly-Ayotte of New Hampshire. She went through a series of town hall meetings after she voted against the Manchin-Toomey bill, and she was really just lampooned by her constituents. Jeff Flake, a new member, senator from Arizona, similarly has really taken a hit in the polls. Will what constituents are saying, in your mind, change these members that come from arguably purple states?
I think it really will. I think it already has, but you're going to see a lot more of this. They're just plainly out of step with their constituents. And the reality is, this isn't even a Second Amendment issue. We already have background checks. No one can plausibly claim that making that ineffective partial background check system more effective is somehow a violation of the Constitution.
What they're saying is we need to make the current background check system more effective before we add another layer.
Well, that's part of their argument, and no one has a problem with making the current system more effective. But when the current system only applies to 60% of transactions, how effective can it really be? I mean, even if you enforce it to the nth degree, you're still leaving a huge back door open.
I want to talk about your district specifically, and specifically the city of Glendale. It's very interesting. They've been making national news lately. There has been a provision before the Glendale City Council to ban gun shows on public property. Glendale Unified has talked about adding panic buttons and security cameras. What do you think about these efforts by localities to take this issue into their own hands?
Well, you know, what we're seeing in the wake of the failure in the Senate is local communities like Glendale, others in my district like West Hollywood who've been out in the vanguard of gun safety legislation for years. You're seeing the states move ahead in Colorado and in Connecticut and elsewhere, basically saying, Congress, if you can't get your act together, we're going to do what we can at the local and state level. And I applaud them for doing it.
What's interesting is, yes, many states are moving in favor of gun control, but some states are going in the opposite direction. Arkansas, Michigan, Mississippi, a lot of these, quote, red states are trying to loosen gun restrictions. It just further shows that divide.
There is a big divide. And I remember when I was first elected in 2000, I was invited on a panel. We were asked about what's the nature of the gun issue in your district. And I said, well, in my suburban LA district, when people think about guns, it's not so much about hunting or self-protection. It's about gang violence and drive-by shootings. They asked a Democratic colleague of mine the same question, Brad Carson of Oklahoma. And he said, in my Oklahoma district, it's also not so much about hunting or self-protection. It's about Lexington and Concord.
It is.
And that shows you, even within two Democratic districts, how diverse the issue is.
His name is Adam Schiff. He is a member of the United States Congress. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition. California Edition, I'm Brad Pomerance. We're coming to you from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. We are inside the Cannon House office building with Lucille Roybal-Allard. She is a member of the US Congress. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
I want to speak with you about gun control, if we may. We're both from the Los Angeles area, and I think it's fair to say that when you speak with Angelenos, the notion of background checks seems very intuitive. The notion that there would not be background checks at gun shows is surprising. And I think we don't realize that, the country's not just Los Angeles. It's the rest of the nation. And so could you give us a sense of the politics of gun control in the nation's capital with 435 members?
Well, I think what's happened is because of the differences in the country, there are many hunters, many who really need their guns because they hunt, and they use that food to bring home. So there's this tremendous fear that if there's any kind of gun control legislation that passes, that it's going to infringe on their rights to have guns. And that really is a misconception. It is not true. What the gun legislation that unfortunately did not pass,
as we know it,
yes, is simply a common sense approach to preventing those who should not be able to get guns through background checks, preventing them from getting guns, while at the same time protecting the rights of law-abiding gun owners. But there's a lot of fear and misinformation that is out there.
But what's so interesting is you look at public opinion polls and you see 90% support expanded background checks. And yet in the Senate, it did get 55%, it needed 60%. Some members of the Senate from purple states have been lambasted for their opposition to Manchin-Toomey. But yet, the NRA recently had a convention. They were invigorated. They were fired up. So do you see progress on gun control? And I ask you specifically, you represent a fairly urban district that in various parts is torn up by gang violence, gun violence.
Yes, and in fact, gun violence and people being killed in Los Angeles because of drive-by shootings is not uncommon.
Right.
But it goes back again to the fact that politics is local.
It is.
And many of the senators who opposed the anti-gun bill really were concerned about their reelection. And it had to do with that more than the merits of the issue in terms of background checks.
Now, but if in the wake of that vote, we have seen members who were concerned about their reelections, their poll numbers have dropped. Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire, Jeff Flake from Arizona, Mark Begich, a Democrat from Alaska. I mean, it does seem that there are consequences.
Right. That's why I think it was a miscalculation on the part of the senators. Because historically, if they voted against the NRA, they lost. I think what has happened is that now with what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, and the public sentiment changing, just the opposite is happening. So I'm hopeful that because of this change in sentiment, that in fact, at least background checks is not a dead issue, but that it is going to come back and that we're going to be able to pass it.
In the House of Representatives?
That's going to be our biggest challenge, is going to be in the House of Representatives. But I can tell you, I'm sure that my colleagues are taking note of what is happening in the Senate with the support of candidates going down.
For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, Congresswoman, I'd like to shift gears and speak about immigration reform. You represent some beautiful portions of Los Angeles with significant immigrant communities.
Yes, I do.
And there are a lot of hopes in those communities that we will see bona fide immigration reform by the end of this year or by the end of this congressional cycle. Are they Pollyanna? Will we see immigration reform, bona fide comprehensive reform in the next year or so?
We are going to see comprehensive immigration reform. It's going to be a battle, and it's not going to be easy, but we are going to have it. And hopefully it's going to be this year. when we will be able to pass that bill.
I want to ask you again about the politics of it. During this trip, I've had the honor to interview two members from the Republican caucus, Jeff Denham, Ken Calvert, both Californians. It's clear to me, or my perception is, they are supporters of immigration reform. How it turns out, we don't know, but they are supporters. They represent California, ag interests. But if you speak to members in the Republican caucus that have minimal immigrant populations, no ag, this is not an issue that is important to their constituents. In fact, they see this as amnesty. How do you get to your Republican colleagues who don't represent districts like Mr. Calvert or Mr. Denham?
Well, I think it's important for them to understand, which I think is happening, is that comprehensive immigration reform goes beyond the 11 million who are now living in the shadows. This is also a national security issue where it's important for us to know who's in this country and whether or not they overstay their visas, because 1/3 of those who are here undocumented actually came here legally. It's also in comprehensive immigration bill that's came out of the Senate, also is very strong in terms of protecting our border. So it goes beyond that. And I think that also the more that my colleagues who don't represent large Latino populations get to interact with the immigrants who are coming to Washington, particularly the Dreamers,
Right.
who are helping to put a human face on the whole issue of immigration, I think that is helping to change the attitudes.
And I think it's fair to say that even the skeptics behind immigration reform would support the efforts to legalize Dreamers, those who were children that were brought here before they hit majority. But there's still this frustration that if you were an adult and you crossed this border illegally, you should not be given a pathway.
Well, what they don't want is amnesty.
Right.
And the bill that has come out of the Senate is far from amnesty.
13-year path.
13 years, they're going to have to meet certain criteria. This
Penalties.
is 13 years just to begin the process. And they're going to have to meet a lot of criteria. They're going to have to pay not only fees, but any back taxes. So it's not amnesty. They are really going to have to work and earn that path to citizenship. And those who do not qualify because they have a criminal record,
Right.
for example, will not qualify and they will be sent back.
On the question of border security, one that is very important to members of the Republican caucus, as the Senate bill is moving forward, it appears that border security will not be a trigger to push the citizenship process forward, that we will not wait for the border to be verified as secure. Do you feel as if that will be a problem for your colleagues in the House who may be skeptical of immigration reform? Because initially there had been this notion that we got to verify border security before we can start that path.
I believe it'll be an issue for some members, but the reality is our border has never been safer, that we have invested over the years millions and millions of dollars.
Billions.
Billions, actually,
Literally.
billions,
Right.
You're right, to secure the border. And in fact, right now, the migration from Mexico is really at zero.
And I know that to be true.
And that is because the economy in Mexico is in many ways doing
Right.
better than our own economy.
When you look at the eyes of a dreamer from your district or their parents, and you talk to them about immigration reform, what's coming back at you?
Well, when you look into their eyes of the dreamers, I see the eyes of an American. Number one, many of them don't even know the country in which they were born. And I also see the pain and the anguish that they feel because in some cases they haven't seen their mother or their father
Right.
for years because they've been deported, or the anguish in the eyes of their younger brothers and sisters who one day they're home and
Right.
their house is raided and their parents are dragged and
I
sent
hear
to
you.
prison.
Her name is Lucille Roybal-Allard. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition. Welcome to California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, coming to you from Washington, D.C. We're inside the Cannon House office building, and look who I found, Lee Baca, the Sheriff of Los Angeles County. What a treat it was to see you in Washington. I'm so glad you can join us. What brings you to the nation's capital?
Well, this is the annual trip that the Board of Supervisors take to Washington to meet with Congress members, to meet with commissions, to discuss with the senators what's going on in Los Angeles and what we need from the Washington view.
Yeah, so what was on the agenda? What did you say to the various members of Congress as you met with them?
Well, one of the greater things that I in particular had to discuss was gun safety. That's a very big issue. The immigration reform aspects of what it means relative to a safer United States.
Let's start with gun safety, if I may. As you know, there was a lot of momentum after the tragedy at Sandy Hook to create new gun regulations, a lot of support behind what we know as a background check, increased background checks, which we have in California, close that gun show loophole. It failed in the Senate. Is that of concern to the Sheriff of Los Angeles County in light of the fact that California does have much stricter laws?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a disappointment factor for public safety across the United States, but the safety is not only in relationship to criminal acts, it's also in relation to personal ownership. And there's a large number of people who injure themselves or are fatally subjected to their own weapon. And so it's not only the idea that criminals shouldn't have guns, and those that do should be punished severely. It's a matter now, is the gun safety strategy of America important enough for Congress and the Senate to do something about this?
And I want to ask you, it's been interesting to me that almost universally we have seen large city sheriffs and police chiefs come out in favor of increased gun regulation, whatever that may mean. And yet their voices didn't seem to carry the day. Why is it that the forces that oppose increased gun regulation seem to prevail?
Well, I think the gun owners that are true enthusiasts, the hunters, they are very good at taking care of their weapons, managing them, and they're not the issue from my point of view, and neither the National Police or Sheriff's Associations. What is the issue is how the urban areas have been so negatively affected by gang members with guns that they acquire illegal through straw buyers. So we want to close the straw buyer loophole. People who are mentally ill who are able to acquire a weapon, and no one seems to be able to do much about it. The underfunding of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, which is a federal agency supposed to regulate all this stuff, is weak in terms of its personnel.
Now, when you met with various members of Congress, I presume you focused on the California delegation. Is that true?
Yes.
Democrats and Republicans probably come at these issues from a similar viewpoint. And so how are you able to prevail on other members from other states on issues that are so impactful to urban communities like Los Angeles?
Well, the way we have to influence the discussion, the debate, the narrative, is that people like me, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was a member of the National Rifle Association. Back then, even assault weapons that were military type was not a supportive position where the National Rifle Association was wanting to expand assault weapons that were military weapons. But things changed in the 70s. It changed more in the 80s. It became more strident in the 90s and currently. So what we need to do is say, first of all, what is the Second Amendment protecting? And first of all, it's also a part of the American Constitution. So we don't want to disturb that. So the National Sheriff's Association take the position that the Second Amendment is, in fact, a right that Americans have. But you can disqualify yourself from that right.
When we come back, I want to continue this conversation about your trip to Washington. We're speaking with Lee Baca, Sheriff of Los Angeles County. For our viewers on HLN, thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. Sheriff, thank you for staying with us. When you met with the members of Congress over the last few days and you spoke with them about immigration and reforming immigration laws, what was your sense? What were they saying back to you?
Well, there was some optimism and some pessimism. I think that our meeting with the Majority Whip, Kevin McCarthy, who's from Los Angeles, meaning not Los Angeles, but California, right. He was very optimistic. He thought that for the senators, the 8 senators that are working on a reform bill, for immigration purposes, we're doing a pretty good job. So it's a wait-and-see process right now.
And what's so interesting, what I've learned over this trip myself, I've spoken with many members from the Republican caucus who represent the state of California, and they do seem to be in favor of immigration reform. Some may be surprised to hear that. The challenge becomes not so much members from the Southwest, Democrats or Republicans, but from areas where there aren't large immigrant communities or large agricultural interests. And that seems to be where the convincing needs to be done. Can you or members from Los Angeles County or other members of Congress work on those members if in fact you are strong advocates for immigration reform?
I listen to the narrative across the country from sheriffs that have rural counties, that have farmers as a dominant residents of those rural counties. Those farmers are terribly afraid of not having harvesters to get their crops to the market, and that includes the animal farming as well. So there's a real priority now. There's about 2,100,000 jobs that involve farming, animal as well as agricultural. And so as a result now, there seems to be a common ground because the rural communities, in fact, are the farm belt of America.
Did members of Congress speak to you, given that you are a senior law enforcement official, about border security?
I mentioned border security. The border has been more secure than ever in the history of the United States, but there's still some loopholes. The Arizona border is one that's got to be closed entirely because it's a frequent route within the United States from those that want to enter. And so I think we're in a positive mode that we have controlled the borders better than ever been controlled before.
But do they believe you? And I'm not calling into question your demeanor, your respect. But look, the narrative is that the border is not secure. Yet if we look at the facts, and I'm not taking a position on border security or the proposals before, we have more agents than we've ever had. We have more fencing than we've ever had. Yet we still hear this narrative that the border is not secure and we shouldn't do anything until we secure our border.
Well, there's a partial truth to that because, as I mentioned, the Arizona side is very difficult to manage, and the sheriffs there, they're on the border, are telling me this directly. But there is a border strategy, and it's a growing success that is one that we have to applaud. So we're going in the right direction. The question now is, what do we do about the immigration issue with the current amount of people who are living in the United States, possibly 10 or 11 million people?
And the big question becomes, do we allow the path to citizenship to commence before or after the border is deemed secure, whatever that may mean? As we speak today, it appears that those two matters can proceed simultaneously. We'll work to further secure the border, but the path will begin. We don't know how that will end, though.
Well, there's a 15-year wind-up before you become a citizen, so there's really a positive side that legalization for work purposes is for phase one.
Right.
When you get down to the legalization and becoming a citizen, that's going to take a much longer period of time, but there's a lot of hope here.
And I want to ask you as a sheriff, there's no question that law enforcement needs to have positive relations with its residents, be it documented or undocumented. And with immigration reform in question, are you able to engage in your investigations, your research with communities? Because there could be a fear that if I talk to law enforcement, I'll be deported. They'll catch me.
Well, this is an important issue that immigrants that cooperate with police might fear that they'll be violated and sent abroad and exported or deported. Right. So the point of it all is that we have a great rapport and a great outreach program because everyone's entitled to personal safety from crime. And we have youth centers in the LA County Sheriff's Department where a lot of the kids there are from immigrant-type parents. So I think that what we have is a possibility that there could be some problems, but the truth is that law enforcement will not be the cause of the problem.
And you're confident that as we march forward through this process, that immigrant communities will continue, at least in Los Angeles County, to feel as if that they can turn to law enforcement, turn to the sheriff when issues come up and not fear retaliation, retribution, or reference to ICE.
Yes, and ICE has remodeled or revised their rules. They have been able to take the higher level offenders, mid to high level offenders, and deport them, and then they're not dealing with the minor traffic offenses. His
name is Lee Baca. He is the sheriff for Los Angeles County visiting the nation's capital. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition.